you ever feel like you can't do anything right in your relationship because your partner is telling you you can't? Everything is your fault, even though you don't really understand what you did wrong. And you start anticipating what your partner can find fault with before you even do something or before you have that next conversation. You're preparing to be told that you're wrong before there's even an opportunity for you to be wrong. Does this sound like your house? That was mine. I've been there. I was made to feel that I couldn't do anything right. I was made to feel that every time something happened, it was my fault, no matter if it was or not. Every time I tried my best not to make a mistake, the worse things got. The more I tried, the more I was punished. I started to prepare myself to be yelled at in every conversation, especially if I dared to talk about something that was not perfect. I had to anticipate how he would find fault in something I did, even when I put every effort in to planning and preparing for something and making sure I made all the decisions that I felt that he would think were the best. If that's your situation too, you're not alone and you're probably wondering how to stop it. Welcome to the He Blamed It On Me podcast. I am your host, Jamie. The He Blamed It On Me podcast is my unfiltered story about living in, leaving, and recovering from a marriage that went from amazing to abusive in a single conversation. This podcast is for survivors, people still in it, and anyone trying to understand emotional abuse. Today, we're going to talk about that feeling of always being wrong, or being told that you're always wrong, or starting to feel that you are always wrong in your relationship. We're going to talk about where that feeling might be originating from and what you can do about it. To start off, I want to address one thing. When you feel that you are always wrong, there's different things that could be causing it. And sometimes it's internal. Sometimes there's things internal to us that make us self-doubt, that make us believe that we are not good enough, that we are actually the root cause of that feeling. In situations like that, they're valid. Situations like that, you might realize, because it's not just in your relationship that you feel like you're always wrong, or you're feeling like things are always your fault, or that you're always making mistakes. It's everywhere in your life that this is showing up. It's not just in your relationship. And while that's all valid and those are important, and those are feelings that need to be addressed, that's not necessarily what we're talking about on today's podcast episode. On today's episode, we are talking about that feeling like you're always wrong because it's your partner that's telling you so. And yes, maybe them telling you so is starting to put you into the place where you now believe that you're always wrong about things, and it's spilling over to other parts of your life, but it originated from inside your relationship. So if you're experiencing other things where maybe it's been every part of your life for as long as you can remember that you always have self-doubt, that you feel wrong, go talk to a therapist about that. Get the support you need. But once again, that's not what we're addressing today on this podcast episode. We are talking about that feeling that is coming from your partner and coming from inside your relationship first. So that feeling that's coming from inside your relationship is based off blame dynamics. So really, what are these blame dynamics? One of the ways to look at it is it's not a single fight where you were wrong. It's not a single conversation where you were told that you were doing things wrong. It's not about being perfect every time. It's a pattern where one person in a relationship is always the person at fault and the other person is never wrong. It's that the person who is never wrong is always the one telling the person who is carrying the blame that they are at fault. And they are telling the person that they are at fault, even when that person who is now carrying the blame doesn't believe they're at fault, or at least at first. So it's that pattern that one person is always wrong and the other person is always right. Every conflict, activity, or conversation, no matter what it's about, ends up with you having to take the responsibility, even when it's something that you should not be taking responsibility for. For example, the store is out of something that your partner wanted. Somehow it's your fault. You should have known. You should have gone to a different store. The kids being too loud or making a mess. It's your fault because you should have them in control. It's your responsibility. Their bad day, your fault. Their reaction to whatever it is that you're telling them, it's your fault. Even their behavior and decisions when you weren't involved are somehow your fault. You start to hear things like, I only reacted this way because you made me. Or if you hadn't done X, I wouldn't have done Y. That's the blame dynamic. The blame isn't distributed based off of what happened. It's pre-assigned by role. You're always to blame, even if you had nothing to do with it, even if you had no control over the situation. It is somehow your fault. This was my experience. As I mentioned a little bit before, this is what I lived through. When a guy hit on me, it was my fault because apparently I am supposed to be able to control other men's behavior, and it's not that man's responsibility to control his own behavior. When I would try to tell him why I felt a certain way, he would yell at me. And it was my fault that he was yelling at me, even though he didn't want to listen to what I had to say and take responsibility for what was making me upset in the first place. And in a lot of those situations, the reason why it was my fault is because I phrased something incorrectly. And if I had said the perfect wording, he would have listened to what I said instead of getting upset and yelling at me. I remember my 39th birthday. This birthday was horrible. This birthday is what led to me eventually realizing getting out of my marriage and divorce was the only option, that there was no love left in my marriage coming my direction. That day of my 39th birthday, I felt like he did below the bare minimum. I felt extremely unloved. And he would always have some excuse. But one of the excuses he had was that about a week and a half beforehand, during a conversation about something dealing with my daughter's sports practice that might potentially fall on my birthday, I made a comment and made a face that he took as an insult to him. And because he took that as an insult to him, he was not going to do anything for my birthday. He was going to hold that against me. So when I am in tears on my birthday because I feel like my husband refused to show me love, and a time when I was begging him to take action and show me something that made it so I believed he loved me and that I was fighting for the right things, he was blaming me. He was blaming me for his inaction. It was my fault that he wouldn't show up for me. When we were in couples therapy, which is something you should absolutely not be doing if you are in an abusive relationship, he would often not do the homework. He would often not put in the effort between sessions. And somehow it was always my fault. I said or did one thing that made it feel like he was okay wasting an entire week and a half and not doing anything. Constantly, he would make promises about date nights as I was begging him to put in effort. And I would be so happy that he was actually going to do something. But those date nights really never happened. They would come and go, and there would not be anything. There was even one time that his parents were coming into town for their family reunion, and he told me he had already arranged with his mother for his mother to watch the kids so we could go off and do something. He never even bothered to make plans. This was a point in time when we were separated, so I was not staying at the beach with him and his parents and the rest of the family. And I waited. And I waited for him to make plans. I made my schedule that week around having availability so we could have these date nights. And they never happened. And then he had all the excuses on why it was my fault that they didn't happen, even though the whole point of our last conversation around these date nights was that he needed to make the effort and he was supposed to contact me with potential dates. I was not supposed to contact him with the potential dates. So how does this happen? How do we get into these blame dynamics? You know that you're not wrong, but you accept the blame anyway. Eventually, you possibly even start questioning whether you really are to blame. It gets to the point where just accepting the blame, even though you know you're not wrong, is easier. Just accept it and move on. Agree with him and move on, or agree with her and move on. Just accept it. And it becomes this dynamic that slowly we allow it to happen, even when we don't want it to happen, even when we know it's wrong. First, it feels like a steady drip. Every argument takes the same dance until it's ending with it being your fault. This little argument here, one out of every few, okay, yep, let me take responsibility, it's my fault. But that's happening more frequently and more frequently and more frequently. And these arguments where you have to accept the blame is starting to add up. Because you think about it, even a faucet that's dripping water eventually can drip a lot of water. It might be slow over time, but that water adds up. And eventually, things being your fault is the standard default to conversations. In a previous episode, we talked about gaslighting. Gaslighting is another way this blame dynamic ends up happening. They start to do things to manipulate your perspective. They start to do things so you doubt your reality and you doubt your ability to trust reality. So in these situations, you go into the conversation knowing that you were not wrong. But then they keep telling you that you were wrong. And they do so in a way that by the end of that conversation, you start to believe that you were wrong in that situation, that maybe it really was your fault. And you start questioning your reality of, how did I not notice that it was my fault? And it's not just one conversation where this gaslighting is happening. It's over and over and over again. And soon, just like that slow drip, they don't even have to gaslight you in a conversation anymore for you to start accepting the blame when it was not your fault. But because all this is happening, your partner is training you to be the perfect partner. And when you're not the perfect partner, it's your fault. It's not that we're human and make mistakes. It's not that things could be other people's responsibility. It's that they trained you to take the fault. So you start apologizing. You apologize for their food being cold when it's delivered at a restaurant. You apologize for being upset when they hurt you. You apologize for the kids making them angry because you should have been the better mother and done something differently versus them being the better parent and stepping in to also parent the children. You start explaining yourself with an apology instead of talking about what happened. And you find yourself in this pattern of accepting your fault no matter what it is. And then there's another reason why sometimes this happens and we get into this pattern. And that could be because you're a generous person. You want your partner to feel good. You want things to go well for them. So you keep looking for how to make things better for them. You keep looking into how to turn a bad situation into a good situation. When that fight happens and they start shifting the blame to you and you see their anger and you see their sadness and you see them raging with emotions, you care more about helping them get through the situation than you do about taking the blame. So if taking the blame helps them feel better, you do it. And you're not doing it because you're weak. You're doing it because you feel like you're doing the right thing by putting them first and focusing on them. Because that's what you do when you're a loving partner. right? But then we're doing it over and over and over again. Your compassion becomes a tool that they can manipulate and start using to get their way and for you to accept the blame in situations when you should not be accepting the blame. So one of the things I notice from being in a relationship like this, it is very hard for you to accept what is actually going on. Even if you were Googling, why am I always at fault in my relationship? Why am I always to blame for everything? You are looking for ways to show that typically you're doing something wrong. You're not typically wanting to find the answers that your partner is contributing to this. You're looking for ways to fix it. And so I know it's hard to accept because I've been there. It's hard to accept when we've put so much effort into our partners and when we love our partners and we got ourselves into this situation typically out of us being good versus us being a bad person. It's hard for us to accept. But here's the tell that you are not the bad person in the situation. You are not the person who is doing things wrong and contributing to this. When you are in a relationship, it should be give and take. There will be times when you are wrong. There will be times when the blame is yours to carry. But there should also be times when the blame is your partner's to carry. They are not a perfect human and they will mess up as well. But do they ever accept blame? Do they ever take responsibility for their actions? Do they ever tell you that they're sorry that this happened and want to work with you to correct things? And no one's perfect. Your partner could get mad at you because the kids are making a lot of noise and they are just at their wits' ends. It's one of those days where they are overstimulating and they yell. But do they come back later and say, I apologize. I am so sorry. I was overwhelmed. I should not have yelled about that. It was not your fault. And I apologize for yelling at you in that moment. Because we are humans. We can make mistakes and tell someone it's their fault when it's really not. And we realize later and make up for it. But if it is always your fault and it is never their fault, you are in a blame dynamic. And you need to work to get out of it. So what can you do? First, recognize the pattern. If you started listening to this podcast because this felt like your relationship or you were nodding along and you were wanting to fix it, you're already recognizing that there is a pattern. So great. If you listen to this podcast just because you're listening to all the episodes and now it's dawning on you that this might be a pattern, good, you're starting to recognize it. But that's step one. You have to recognize that the pattern of blame is there before you can do anything else about it. 2, set boundaries. And I know this is hard. It is very hard to tell someone who's blaming you all the time that you will no longer accept the blame. But you need to start setting boundaries for yourself. You need to be brave enough to say, that is not my responsibility. Brave enough to say, we will continue this conversation later, but I will not be yelled at when I'm telling you that I'm upset. I will not allow the conversation to move to that until we're done with this. You have to be able to communicate clearly that you are noticing the unfair blame and establish limits to kind of control the emotional manipulation that's going on. It's hard. I know it. Let me tell you about some things in my situation. So after I moved out, we were still going to marriage counseling to try to fix the marriage. Once again, it is not recommended that you go to marriage counseling if you are in an abusive relationship. But I didn't know that at the time. So we were there, just like many people end up finding themselves there. And we'd be talking about things and the blame cycle would come up. And it was always my husband couldn't do things because of this. And then instead of the focus being on his abusive behavior, that was clearly being laid out as abusive behavior in our therapy sessions, the The therapist would shift to me and said, well, how about you do this when this happens? How about you do this? And essentially saying that in ways that it was my responsibility to take the blame. And if I took the blame here, it would allow us to focus on this thing over here and allow us to move forward into other conversations. And I eventually had to say no, that I was not going to take the blame for things that I was not responsible for. And we needed to focus on why he was placing the blame on me in the first place, instead of me taking the blame and hoping that that made it so he would take responsibility for something else. I had to say no, and it was hard. The second example is something that will come in much, much later in my story. It was my 40th birthday. At this point in time, once again, I had already moved out, and we're trying to see if we could salvage our marriage. I really didn't think it would be salvageable at this point in time and had already started planning for divorce. But my husband told me for my 40th birthday he wanted to take me out on a one-to-one date. And I said yes. It never happened. He never mentioned again. He never attempted to make plans. And after my birthday, he told me we needed to talk. And I specifically told him I did not want to talk to him if he was going to tell me that it was my fault that he didn't take me out for my birthday. And of course, he told me that was not the reason he wanted to talk, but it was 100% the reason that he wanted to talk. He wanted to blame me for him not taking action. The next thing you should do is seek support. But once again, avoid couple counseling, but go get individual support. And one of the things I will say is really important here is these aren't necessarily in order. If you are in an abusive relationship, you might want to seek the counseling and get some of the other help before trying to set boundaries. Because if your partner is abusive, it might not be safe for you to set those boundaries. So really evaluate your situation to realize where you need to go next and what you need to do and how you need to protect yourself. It's also super important for you to practice self-care and compassion. There will be times as you move forward that even though you know you shouldn't, you will accept the blame because it's easier. Instead of feeling guilty that you accepted the blame, realize that you did it to protect yourself from the rest of that conversation that would have continued if you didn't. That's not a long-term solution for you to give yourself compassion because you accepted the blame and you ended an argument that could have continued. It's a short-term solution to protect yourself. But we have to realize that sometimes self-preservation and protecting ourselves is important. And when you do accept the blame when things are not your fault, and it's not necessarily because you're thinking about protecting yourself in that moment, it's still okay because you are becoming aware of it. And you're taking other steps, hopefully, to end the situation. If it's possible, encourage a relationship where there is mutual accountability. Talk about it. Communicate. Now, once again, if you are in an abusive relationship, this might not be a safe conversation. But if your relationship has gotten to the point of healing, or it's early enough in things where you feel like you could have a conversation, attempt to have that conversation. Discover ways together where you can hold yourself accountable to this goal of having mutual responsibility and accountability. But remember, if they can't change, it's not a safe place for you. You deserve to be with a partner that shows you respect and is willing to accept the blame when they are wrong. To conclude for today, just remember that the reason everything feels like it's your fault is not because it's your fault. Your partner has created a pattern that made it so you felt like you needed to accept the blame for anything that goes bad, anything that appears to be wrong, or anything they simply want to be mad about. But it's not your fault. Yes, sometimes we are not perfect and we will make mistakes, but everything is not your fault. To conclude, it was a system that was created in your relationship that was built to make sure that the fault always fell on you. The feeling is real, but the verdict that's leading to these feelings is rigged. You are not always to blame.